Yeah, and then the tilt to.
Got it. All right. Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning. You well, too.
Oh, yeah, I'll give you a little look. We may have to slide you around to let Miss Mary up. She's in the chair.
She said she wants to look at this one, and this one, some of this back.
Oh, can she get this?
Well, we're still deciding now.
Slide it this way a little bit.
Oh, no.
You ready?
Watch this.
No.
We'll get it through.
Okay.
Yeah. Everybody else doing okay?
Good morning, Director. How are you?
Good morning. I don't recognize you with your new hairdo and a face mask
Yeah.
on.
I'm traveling in disguise.
See you. Good morning. All right.
I know, I had to cut my dad's hair and all,
You what?
I cut my dad's hair and for the second time, and he's a Mexican coming up.
Good. A health screening.
We're just trying your skill set.
Good.
Yeah,
How you
thankfully,
doing?
I actually did have a haircut
Recorder
machine,
guy?
and I found a really good.
Making sure all I can.
There you go.
Professional that's cut. So,
My husband says he's not going back to the barber. I just get the wall clippers and,
that,
yeah.
I still haven't been in 5 months now.
well, looks good.
My hair was old, so my hair grows fast. So I actually kind of like it like it is, so I'm maybe it stay this way. I like it.
Start putting it in a little ponytail.
I bet you don't have nothing I could put a little bit back in. I did that at my wife's very first day with the hairdresser was old. She was that first. The very first.
We have, that's our responsibility.
Yep. Yep, say that again.
We have to-
Oh, she's doing it. All right, good for you.
They are full-time.
Yep, they are. Got that.
I'm just trying to see where everybody, since you'll have assigned seating.
Oh, yes. That's our in-house attorney, Chris Sessions.
I missed that Gene altogether, but.
Did she give you a copy of the speech yet?
Yes, I have a copy.
Okay.
I love your shoes.
All right, I'll be the driver. We'll get you.
Okay.
You gonna do it all the way?
Yeah.
Okay, come on.
Strong.
Okay, all right. Got it, got it.
All right.
Thank you. I'm just kidding.
Right.
It's kind of fun.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
103. We're ready and, yeah.
Yeah, it is hard to use a mask on.
Ready? I can't tell her no. No, but no matter what the age. No, we miss her. We miss her for sure, but thank you for asking.
All right, appreciate it, Dan. If I need you, I'll home.
I hope they do well and good job.
And then.
That's okay.
I'm gonna pass the, orders from left to right, I'm bringing them up to you, and then you pass them that way. and you-
Okay.
Vince, how did your hearing go yesterday?
Oh, it was fine. I did see, Judge Riley while I was up there.
There was no testimony, right?
Yes, sir, just chop chop, so.
Hi, Mayor.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Got you down on the lower level.
On the other end?
No, right here in the middle.
Well, let's see what happens. Look at that, we got empty chairs here. Yeah.
How much you gonna live this?
Right, I was talking about that one. That's on this road.
Yeah, that's agenda, yeah, the
Sure,
next
where we-
agenda item.
You're
Right here, okay.
At the end.
Yeah.
Wearing glasses with a mask on is tough.
Well, I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is the 6/10/2020 meeting of the Environmental Management Commission. We do have a quorum present. Vice Chair Brown was unable to make it this morning, but everyone else is here. Our first agenda item is to consider, consider the meeting. Minutes from February 14th, 2020, which was our last meeting. We did not have the April meeting, as you will recall. I'll entertain a motion from the commissioners to accept or reject these minutes.
I move we adopt the minutes of the February 14th, 2020 commission meeting as circulated.
I'll second that motion.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? If not, I'll call for the question, and we have been requested, since we're wearing masks, to vote by raising the right hand. So all in favor, please raise your right hand. All opposed, same sign. The minutes are accepted. Our next item on the agenda is our report from the Director McClure. Director McClure will give you the floor.
If you'll indulge me, I'm going to lower my mask while I speak so that you all can hear me and so that my glasses won't fog. Dual reason here. Good morning to all and welcome. The April 10th Commission meeting was canceled, so this is the fourth meeting of the Alabama Environmental Management Commission for fiscal year 2020. And everyone's attention is on COVID-19 disease caused by the coronavirus. My report today will be very brief and to minimize the potential exposure for those in the audience. The work of the department was deemed to be an essential function of the state government that needs to continue to the maximum degree possible during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our essential function is set out in our mission to assure a safe, healthful, and productive environment. In the performance of our work, the health and safety of our personnel is primary. To protect our personnel, all safety measures recommended by CDC and the Alabama Department of Public Health are being practiced. The governor's shelter-in-place authorized state employees to telework. The department is highly automated and well-positioned to implement a telework program. A number of procedures were put in place to carry on the department's work with the maximum reliance on telework. Those procedures include minimal on-site presence, rotating on-site work schedules to achieve all essential functions, minimizing congregating and face-to-face meetings, and daily communication by each employee with his or her supervisor. Systems support has been provided to enable telework, including a virtual private network for each employee working remotely to maintain security. As resources allow, laptop computers are made available to those who do not already have a work laptop. We're still working on technical issues with those who don't have access to high-speed internet and ways to avoid caller ID disclosure of personal telephone numbers to work contacts. Microsoft Teams, Skype, and Zoom internet conferencing applications are being utilized. Incoming telephone calls are automatically forwarded to individuals working remotely. Performance is an important consideration in a teleworking program. Each division is tracking quantitative and qualitative productivity measures. Performance results fall into two categories. First, those areas with little or no loss of productivity. These include permit writing, IT work, automated remote reporting, document reviews, processing of enforcement actions, engineering, intergovernmental communications, maintenance, and other activities where face-to-face interaction is not required. These are at normal levels, and in some cases, productivity is above normal levels. In our Office of General Counsel, legal matters are also being addressed as normal, including the increased workload responding to the increased number of lawsuits, appeals, and petitions being filed by environmental groups during the coronavirus crisis. Second, areas where productivity has dropped include inspections, sample collections, and associated lab analyses. Although EPA has indicated it will make allowances for reduced inspections during the pandemic, the department is developing plans to make up lost ground on inspections. Overall, productivity appears to be greater than 80% of normal. This is only possible because no employee furloughs have been mandated. By continuing to perform our essential functions, ADEM is accomplishing its mission. Regulated industries in Alabama are being required to meet their environmental obligations. As a result, industry should have no environmental regulatory matters delaying the restarting of operations. The department has taken advantage of an excellent opportunity to assess more modern work methods that maintain productivity, build morale, and help retain the next generation of engineers and scientists. The department's major initiatives and financial condition have not been materially impacted during these extraordinary times. We continue to be on schedule with the extensive computer systems upgrade that will carry us well into the future, the final phase of the Birmingham field office upgrade that will modernize our lab facilities remains on the same schedule we had before the pandemic, and the new Mobile facility to house our Mobile field office and coastal program is progressing as planned. Although it is anticipated there will be a slight decline in permit fee income due to reduced economic activity, our FY 2020 federal and state budgets are currently in good shape to weather the storm. The FY 2021 general fund budget passed the legislature and was signed by the governor. It appropriates the same funding for ADEM as the prior year, and that, along with other funding sources, will be adequate to fund all current activities of the department. Despite the pandemic, our people continue to work on professional development. I am pleased to report that Devin Jenkins in our land division has achieved an important career milestone by earning his designation of professional engineer. He is not in the room today, but I'll introduce him at a future commission meeting. Devin, congratulations to you. That concludes this abbreviated report. I'll be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions? Thank you, Director.
Thank you.
It's now time for us to begin evaluation of Director LaFleur's performance for the last year. We last did an evaluation in October of 2019, and so what we would like to do is ask the Personnel Committee to provide a report to us at the October meeting. We would like for them to ask for comments from commissioners, the public, environmental groups, anyone who'd like to comment, please do so, and we will certainly circulate those comments among the commission. Let's see now, our Personnel Committee is headed by Tom. All right, Tom, would you take that on as a project then? All right. And we'll send out some deadlines as far as providing comments to the commission and the committee regarding Director LaFleur's performance. Our next item on the agenda is Black Warrior Riverkeeper versus ADEM and Metal Plate Galvanizing LP, which is EMC docket number 19-01. We are going to today to consider hearing officer's report. I can't talk this thing, I'm sorry. Hearing officer's report, and also possibly oral arguments from the attorneys for both sides. The department and the intervener submitted replies to the petitioner's objections. I will entertain a motion regarding the petitioner's request for oral argument and limiting the amount of time to be allotted to this oral argument. Is there any one who'd like to make a motion?
Move to grant the petitioner's request for oral arguments and allot a maximum of 10 minutes for each party in oral argument.
All right, is there a second to that?
Second to the motion.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, I'm going to call for the question. We have a motion and a second to provide the petitioner's request for oral argument for a maximum of 10 minutes. All in favor say aye, or raise your hand right. And all opposed, raise your hand again. All right, Ms. Dillard, we're going to allot you 10 minutes. And I would encourage you, if possible, we have had your objections circulated to the commission, and all had a chance to read and study those. And I would encourage you, if you have different information, to please provide that. Welcome.
Thank you. And with the commission's permission, I'd like to take my mask off during argument. Thank you for granting argument. My name is Eva Dillard, and I represent the petitioner, Black Warrior Riverkeeper, in this matter. We are a citizen-based nonprofit dedicated to improving water quality, habitat, and recreation, not to mention public health, throughout the Black Warrior watershed. There is a significant residential population around the two metal plate facilities that are subject to this appeal. If you look to the bottom of this slide, you will see an area outlined in purple. Near this area, there is a Birmingham public housing complex. There's a Jefferson County Head Start Center. There are churches, there's a park, and other residential uses. Over here for metal plate number 2, which is outlined in brown, there are single-family homes around that. Why does that matter? We're having a national conversation right now about racism and its legacy. Studies show that pollution disproportionately affects people of color and people in low-income communities. That's because historically, loose permitting requirements and exclusionary zoning laws have funneled racial and ethnic minorities into areas with a greater degree of environmental degradation. And that is true of the areas around the 2 metal plate galvanizing plants. According to EPA's Environmental Justice Mapping and Screening Tool, which calculates burdens, the areas around Plant 1 and Plant 2 have an index of 95.3 and 95 for wastewater discharge concerns. These concerns place these areas around the facilities, among the nation's worst 5%. These are some discharges from Plant 2. These are some discharges from Plant 1. One constant over the 20 years that metal plate has been permitted to operate these 2 plants, significant concentrations of zinc in their stormwater. Congress explicitly intended for industrial stormwater dischargers like metal plate to comply strictly with permitting requirements and state water quality standards. However, these permits, as written, do not comply with the Clean Water Act. In the interests of time, we will stand on the objections that we detailed in our filing, but I do want to highlight a couple of the key points that I think offer the Commission the clearest path to a remand of the permit, which is what we think you should vote to do. A permit writer starts by developing technology-based effluent limitations, which, as you know, are exactly what they sound like. They're based on the availability and cost of pollution control technology. EPA has national categorical standards for some industries. For others, it does not. Where it does not, the permit writer, like ADEM, must apply certain factors. They use best professional judgment, but must apply these mandatory factors. These are those factors. We set them out in our filing. Even though ADEM has considerable discretion in evaluating the relevant factors and determining the weight to be accorded each, ADEM must apply those factors. So the record reflects that ADEM did not. The hearing officer's recommendation that the permit be sustained on this point is plainly erroneous and inconsistent with applicable law. Whereas here, technology-based effluent limitations are not enough to protect water quality, ADEM must take another step and develop water quality-based effluent limitations. They are developed to achieve compliance with established water quality standards. Technological feasibility and economic reasonableness are not factors that are considered in developing these limitations. The parties agree that a water quality-based effluent limitation is required for these permits. ADEM's water quality-based effluent limitations, or QBELs, fail to comply with the Clean Water Act in a number of critical respects. First, they add nothing to the technology-based effluent limitations. Both rely on BMP's zinc minimization and monitoring. Here is the QBEL, and you will see highlighted in white, zinc minimization, BMP's monitoring. For the technology-based effluent limitation, the same. BMP's zinc minimization and monitoring. The whole idea behind a water quality-based effluent limitation is it is required when the technology-based limitation is not stringent enough to protect water quality. So you can't have a water quality-based effluent limitation that's identical to the technology limitation because that doesn't comply with the Clean Water Act. Here, just like in the case we cited, the technology-based limitation and the water quality-based limitation are indistinguishable. The record demonstrates that the water quality-based effluent limitations in these permits add nothing of substance to the technology limitations, and the hearing officer's recommendation that they be sustained on this point is plainly erroneous and inconsistent with applicable law. Another reason ADEM's Q-Bell fails to protect water quality in the receiving streams is that the Q-Bell doesn't address the actual receiving streams. Metal Plate and ADEM would have you believe that Village Creek is the point of compliance. It is not. The permit also must protect water quality in the receiving streams. It does not. Riverkeeper offered evidence that on occasion the streams below these plants are not meeting water quality standards, and Metal Plate's own sampling and testing shows excessive concentrations of zinc in the stormwater that the low flow streams below these plants simply cannot assimilate. Again, the water quality-based effluent limitation fails to provide how, when, or whether the zinc management plans that ADEM wrote will ensure the receiving streams, the streams immediately below the plants, will meet the state's acute water quality standards for zinc. Another reason these permits fail to comply with the Clean Water Act is that numeric limits are feasible here. The Clean Water Act authorizes the use of BMPs under certain situations, but only one authorizes BMPs in place of numeric effluent limitations, and that is when those limitations are infeasible. ADEM states that numeric limits are infeasible here because stormwater events are unpredictable with varying discharge rates and pollution loadings with different flows in the receiving water bodies. However, ADEM's stormwater branch routinely develops and applies numeric criteria to the stormwater runoff being discharged by surface mines. Just like Metal Plate's discharges, they are precipitation driven with no way to estimate how or when they will discharge, what the pollution concentrations in those discharges are, or what the existing water quality is in the receiving streams, just like Plant 1 and Plant 2. Moreover, Metal Plate Galvanizing runs a similar galvanizing operation in Atlanta. That plant has a numeric limit based upon that state's acute water quality criterion for zinc because an extensive suite of BMPs there just didn't work. ADEM failed to develop a numeric limitation for zinc tied to the acute water quality standard, despite the fact that Georgia did, and despite the fact that ADEM developed similar limitations for surface minings. And I don't understand how it can be feasible to have a numeric limit in Georgia and not have one in Alabama. ADEM also failed to establish a valid compliance schedule for the permits. Typically, permits require compliance upon issuance. If ADEM is going to postpone compliance with water quality standards, they have to obey the regulations that set out what a compliance schedule must contain. A compliance schedule under the regulations has many requirements, as you can see from the word salad up there. Unfortunately, the permit record here shows that ADEM did not include any of those. The record demonstrates that ADEM met none of the statutory requirements for a compliance schedule in the permits, and that is another reason for the commission to remand these permits to ADEM. Finally, ADEM failed to comply with the Clean Water Act's public participation requirements. Public participation the permits provide that the zinc management plans, which are the water quality-based effluent limitations, will be developed in the future as Metal Plate determines the contents of those plans. That approach violates the public participation requirements of the Clean Water Act. I note that almost 2 years post-permit issuance, Metal Plate is still working on revising those plans. The latest iteration was in February of this year, so there still isn't even a final plan or final water quality-based effluent limitation under these permits. That is another basis for the commission to remand these permits. In sum, the permits fail to comply with the Clean Water Act because the technology-based effluent limitation is not valid because it doesn't apply the mandatory factors. There's not a valid water quality-based effluent limitation because the water quality-based effluent limitation adds nothing to the technology limitation. It fails to protect the receiving streams. Numeric limits are feasible. The compliance schedule fails to meet regulations, and public participation in developing the water quality-based effluent limitation was denied. the EMC must remand the permits to ADEM for correction. By postscript, every time I have a filing, I update the compliance information for metal plate galvanizing. I note again, some 2 years after these permits were issued, it'll be 2 years in September, they are still discharging significant concentrations of zinc at both Plant 1 and at Plant 2. And these discharges are not being adequately controlled by the permits. Despite the zinc management plans, the most recent data shows that metal plate is discharging zinc concentrations that are as much as 240 times and 517 times the state's acute water quality criteria for zinc. This is based on metal plate's own sampling. It is past time for ADEM to write permits that comply with the Clean Water Act. We ask you to vote to reject the hearing officer's recommendations and remand these permits to ADEM. Thank you.
Do you have anybody from the department who'd like to respond to this? Thank you, Ms. Dillon.
Sorry.
Good morning, Chair Miller and Commissioners. My name is Carrie Blanton, and Monica Giroux and I represent the department in this matter. The hearing officer has recommended that the Commission deny the relief requested in Riverkeeper's notice of appeal, deny Riverkeeper's motion for summary judgment, grant the department and Metal Plate's motion for summary judgment, and approve both of Metal Plate's permits as issued. The department urges you to adopt these recommendations in full. Riverkeeper's objections merely reiterate the original issues and requests for relief raised in its permit appeal, and as later expanded through its motion for summary judgment. The department, in turn, has responded to all of these objections through its own motion for summary judgment, subsequent responsive pleadings, and an oral argument. Thus, these objections raise no issues to which the hearing officer has not already fully considered before making his report and recommendation to you. Riverkeeper bore the burden to prove the permits were improper, and based on the record before you, the hearing officer found the petitioner failed to satisfy that burden. The crux of Riverkeeper's appeal and the heart of these objections today are to convince the Commission to compel the department to put numeric effluent limits for zinc in Metal Plate's permits for its stormwater discharges. The bottom line is that it's infeasible for the department to calculate a scientifically justifiable numeric limit for effluent for zinc in these two permits. And that's okay. Numeric effluent limits for zinc on Metal Plate's stormwater discharges are not required by any statute or regulation, and they're not necessary for these permits to be protective of water quality. Not only are numeric effluent limits not required, but the applicable regulations expressly envision circumstances in which non-numeric limitations, such as best management practices, are appropriate to control the discharges of pollutants, including circumstances such as these, where numeric effluent limits are infeasible. Depositions of the permit writer and departmental experts in the record before you describe in detail why it is infeasible for them to calculate a scientifically justifiable numeric limit for these permits. The hearing officer agreed with that finding of infeasibility, notwithstanding Riverkeeper's arguments, and noted the department provided ample evidence showing it was within its regulatory authority in its imposition of non-numeric effluent limits to carry out the purposes and intent of the Alabama Water Pollution Control Act. As this commission has previously held, the department cannot be held in error for failing to require something which is not required by statute or regulation. Moreover, the zinc minimization plans required by these permits are consistent with the Village Creek total maximum daily loads goal of achieving overall zinc reductions in the watershed from all stormwater sources. The success of a TMDL's implementation through our NPDES permitting program is measured by improvements in water quality. Water quality monitoring performed by the department has revealed that Village Creek is no longer impaired for zinc, indicating the department's approach to targeting zinc reductions in the watershed has proven to be successful. The record supports the findings that the final permits comply with the applicable regulations, are consistent with the goals of the Village Creek TMDL, and were developed to be protective of water quality. For these reasons, the department respectfully asks the Commission to adopt the hearing officer's recommendations in full and reject petitioner's objections. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anybody who is speaking for Metal Point? I think we do.
And thank you to the Commission for the opportunity to speak. My name is Max Zygmunt. I am counsel to Metal Plate in this matter. And we'll try to be as brief as possible. First, we'd like to say Metal Plate, of course, wholeheartedly endorses everything that you've just heard from Ms. Blanton. And we, of course, appreciate you also allowing me just a few minutes here to highlight some additional key information that supports the Commission's, or should support the Commission's adoption of Judge Hampton's recommendations that the permits issued to Metal Plate be upheld as written. I have 3 key points to make, and the first and third of which will be especially brief. But those 3 points are that Metal Plate's Atlanta plant, yes, it's subject to numeric effluent limitations for zinc for stormwater, but that doesn't necessarily mean that such a limit's feasible for its Birmingham plants. The second point is that Riverkeeper's allegations of historical compliance issues are simply irrelevant to the issue at hand here, which is the lawfulness of the permits issued at this time. And then the final point is that these permits are consistent with the TMDL and water quality-based permitting requirements. So first, about the Atlanta plant. Yes, as I noted, the Atlanta plant is subject to stormwater limitations that are numeric effluent limitations for zinc. But again, that doesn't mean that those same sorts of numeric effluent limitations are feasible for the Birmingham plants. You know, the Atlanta plant, as Ms. Dillard highlighted, is obviously in a different state, subject to a different regulator. But those aren't the only differences. Of course, you know, being in that different state, it has a location that's unique to it, has its own layout, its own geology, its own topography, its own surrounding land uses. You know, in fact, even the Birmingham facilities have some significant differences among them. So what that means is, I think an analogy might be helpful. It's like the Atlanta plant and the Birmingham plants, it's like they're all Chevys, right? But knowing a Chevy doesn't mean you know what you can do with the vehicle. Like Chevy Tahoe and a Camaro. They're both Chevys, they run on gas, they're V8s, you know, some of their interior features even look the same, they have similar technology in them. But I can go 4-wheel driving in one or tow a boat in one, and you know, I can't, but maybe somebody else could slide the Camaro around a track going 160 miles an hour. So knowing it's a Chevy doesn't mean that you know what is feasible with that particular Chevy. So too with these facilities. So without having evidence in the record to explain why, despite those inherent differences in the facility, the Atlanta experience maps onto the Birmingham plants, there's no evidence to conclude that the Atlanta plant and what has happened there is relevant in any way, shape, or form to what's feasible in Birmingham. And that sort of evidence to connect those dots is not in the record. And as a result, for purposes of this case, what has occurred at the Atlanta plant is simply irrelevant. So the second point I'd like to hit is sort of the water quality point. Village Creek, is the record before you reflects, and we've written about, is attaining water quality criteria for zinc. That's been demonstrated in the department's recent monitoring initiative in connection with Village Creek. And not only is it attaining water quality standards, it's attaining them by more than an order of magnitude, according to the water quality chief. And of course, attaining those water quality standards for zinc was the very purpose of the TMDL. Importantly, that water quality improvement over the 15 years or so since the establishment of the TMDL, a lot of stakeholders had input into achieving that. While the bulk of that improvement was occurring, Metal Plate had its old permits, which are less strict than the current permits. Riverkeeper critiques the permits, but the zinc minimization plan requirements include a zinc focus that was not previously present in the permitting that Metal Plate was subject to. The monitoring requirements are three times as intense as they were before. So what does that mean for us? The fact that the permits are more strict and water quality criteria are already being met in Village Creek and the TMDL's purpose is satisfied means that these newer, stricter permits are necessarily consistent with the water quality requirements for Village Creek as well as the Village Creek TMDL. Now, Riverkeeper has also emphasized that Village Creek isn't the only water that's relevant for purposes of these permits. And while that's true, because Metal Plate's stormwater first flows through at Plant 1, an unnamed tributary to Village Creek, and at Plant 2, an unnamed tributary to Avondale Creek, focusing on those waters doesn't really change the analysis. Talk about Plant 1 first. Ms. Dillard showed you some discharge numbers of zinc associated with Plant 1. An important thing to recognize about Plant 1 that you might not pick up on from Riverkeeper's papers is at Plant 1, Metal Plate stormwater first falls into the Birmingham sewer system, where it commingles with stormwater from part of the greater Birmingham area, before eventually two different Birmingham sewer pipes, one carrying Metal Plate stormwater commingled with other stormwater, the other carrying general urban stormwater, they both empty into the unnamed tributary to Village Creek. And it's what the water quality is at that point and what the influence of Metal Plate's discharge is at that point, at the unnamed tributary, not in the sewer system. That's the question that matters. And there's very little evidence or data on that question. However, what evidence and data that there is, in fact, it's Riverkeeper's data, shows that that Metal Plate's discharge from Plant 1 doesn't really move the needle from a water quality standpoint in the unnamed tributary to Village Creek. Why do I say that? Riverkeeper, on one event, sampled water from both of those pipes that I mentioned that empty into and essentially begin the unnamed tributary to Village Creek. And Riverkeeper's own expert identified those sample results as quote unquote similar in terms of the zinc content. The reality is that zinc can be measured and dissolved in total. For one of those measurements, the pipe that actually did not have Metal Plate stormwater in it had more zinc, and as compared to the pipe that did have Metal Plates. And for the other measure, it was about the same. What does that tell us? That tells us that, as Chris Johnson, the Water Branch chief, testified, zinc is ubiquitous in the urban environment. And in fact, Riverkeeper's expert agreed with that. In fact, this evidence shows us that the zinc in the urban environment is so ubiquitous and the volume of flow within the MS4 is so significant that by the time Metal Plate stormwater mixes with all of that, you can't discern what influence the Metal Plate stormwater is or isn't having. It's just not moving the needle for water quality in the unnamed tributary to Village Creek. So there just isn't evidence in the record that would allow Judge Hampton or the commission to conclude that the permit for Plant 1 will necessarily cause water quality standard exceedances in the unnamed tributary to Village Creek, and consequently, Plant 1 permit is consistent with water quality requirements. Similarly, at Plant 2, Plant 2 is not the only source of stormwater to the unnamed tributary to Avondale Creek. So again, because of the conceded ubiquity of zinc in the urban environment, again, Mr. Johnson testified that, in short, a robust scientific water quality study would be needed to determine whether and the extent to which the unnamed tributary to Avondale Creek may not be attaining water quality standards, and again, whether that would be attributable in any way to metal plate. So at Plant 2, just as at Plant 1, our view of the evidence is that Riverkeepers failed to demonstrate, again, that Plant 2 discharges under the that will cause or contribute to water quality exceedances. Now, final point is with respect to historical allegations that Riverkeeper has identified. So this case is about the lawfulness of these permits right now. And nevertheless, Riverkeeper continues to emphasize allegations that are in some cases nearly 10 years old and occurred under other permits. But the reality now is that Metal Plate's demonstrating a commitment to compliance and is working to continually improve. So you've heard the much maligned zinc minimization plans that Riverkeeper has referenced. ADEM has expressly authorized and approved Metal Plate to proceed with some of the most significant aspects of those plans, and committing Metal Plate to a path for significant capital investments at both plants to reduce zinc discharges. So as testified to by ADEM, these permits call for the company to do the work to further drive down zinc discharges and further improve water quality, and Metal Plate is doing the work. Unless there are any questions, that'll conclude my remarks.
I'd like to ask if any of the commissioners have questions for any of the three attorneys. Certainly like to open the floor. Are there any questions for any of the three attorneys? All right. At this point, we need to see if we can get a motion to either adopt the hearing officer's report or recommend that the petitioner's alternative order be instituted. I'm opening the floor for motion.
I move we adopt the hearing officer's report and recommendation to the commission.
We have a motion to accept the hearing officer's report. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
And a second. Is there any further discussion that we need to have regarding this motion? All right, I'm going to call for the question. All in favor of the motion to accept the hearing officer's report, please signify by raising your right hand. All opposed, same sign. The hearing officer's report is accepted. we need to permit to sign thing. All right. Our next agenda item is number 5, Bobby Lewis et al. Versus ADEM and the City of Dothan. TMC docket number 1906. We will consider the report of the hearing officer, which includes finding of facts, conclusion of law, and a recommendation. We have objections from petitioners, we have an ADEM response, and an intervener response. First, I'd like to open the floor to ask the commissioners if we would like to grant oral objections by the attorneys to these to this report. I'll open the floor to
Move to grant the request for oral argument, a lot of maximum of 7 minutes for each party in oral argument.
All right, do we have a second?
Second motion.
And a second. Any further discussion? All in favor of allowing the oral arguments, please signify by raising your right hand. All opposed, same sign. We will press forward and,
7.
is that Mr. Lutter I see back there? Okay. I couldn't recognize you behind the back. At this point, I think what we're going to do is ask Mr. Lutter to go first, and then ADEM and City of Dothan can decide who wants to go second and third. Mr. Lutter, welcome. Thank you very much for being
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the Commission's permission, I'll lower my mask too, but especially if you have an objection, Mr. Massengill.
No.
Okay. Thank you. I represent the residents who appealed the permit modification issued by the department for the Dothan sanitary landfill. The hearing officer has ruled that the permit should be disapproved by the commission. This is the same hearing officer that handled the Riverkeeper case. He recommended disapproval on the basis of 2 issues that he ruled in our favor on, but he also ruled against us on 4 other issues. And so we have filed objections on those 4 other issues, but we certainly support his conclusion on the first 2 issues. But given that those first 2 issues are going to be the main argument as to whether or not you decide to approve or disapprove or accept or reject his recommendation, I'm going to focus my argument on those first 2 issues. Before I do that, however, let me, you all know that the hearing record in this case was some 1,800 pages, representing 24 witnesses and over 100 exhibits. There were multiple briefs filed, objections filed, responses filed. It's a very large record. I want to remind you that your rules require you to recuse yourself from voting on any appeal where you have not read and considered the entire record. So if you haven't read those 1,800 pages, if you haven't looked at those 100 exhibits and looked at all the documents filed by the lawyers, you are supposed to recuse yourself from voting. And I trust that you will do so if that's the situation. The 2 arguments, or the 2 issues that the hearing officer agreed with us on was that the city of Dothan did not demonstrate that it had obtained host government approval of the ADEM application. Now, the fundamental issue on that, or the fundamental disagreement on that issue, is an interpretation of the statute. The statute, in fact, says that the department may not consider an application for a modified permit for a facility unless such application has received approval pursuant to this section by the affected local governing body. So the focus of the debate falls on the words "such application." What does that refer to? Does it refer to the immediately preceding reference to the department may not consider an application for a modified permit? Or does it refer to some other application? Well, the courts in Alabama have decided what the meaning of the word "such" is. It's an adjective, and it's used when reference to a previously mentioned category or thing is in the language. And so in this case, and in fact the court was interpreting the same statute but a different subsection when it came to this decision about what "such" means. And they said, if you look at "such," I mean, if "such" is there, it's referring to something immediately preceding that. In this case, the language that "such" refers to is the ADEM permit application. Now, there is argument, and there's also court authority, that you have to look at the whole statute, not just one subsection of the statute, to figure out what's meant. In this case, if you look at the whole statute, that also supports the idea that that the application that the city has to approve is not some other application, but the ADEM application. The city did not, the evidence is conclusive that the city did not approve the ADEM application. The ADEM application didn't even exist when the city issued its host government approval. So they could not have. Given the time, I'm going to have to move on to the second issue, which has to do with the obtaining sufficient measurements of groundwater elevations beneath the landfill. Your rules establish the requirements for how that's to be done. And it says that you have to take 2 measurements during each of 3 consecutive months of February, March, and April. And none of those measurements can be less than 12 days apart. Well, in fact, the application shows that the city did not comply with that. They submitted a whole host of data, a lot of it outside the period of February, March, and April. The courts have said that agencies are required to vigorously apply their rules. There's no option here to look at expert evidence if the rules say what they say and they didn't comply with the rule. Doesn't matter what the experts say. If they didn't submit the required information, that should be the end of it. Now, lastly, let me just say that I think it's probably a rare situation where the hearing officer recommends disapproval of a permit. In this case, the hearing officer said at the end of his recommendation, the undersigned cannot recommend that the commission approve actions that do not comply with ADEM regulations. He concluded that this application with respect to host government approval and these groundwater elevation measurements do not comply. After multiple days, I think we were in 8 days of testimony. That was his conclusion. With that, my time is up, and I will retire.
All right, thank you, Mr. Williams.
Thank you.
All right, now, are we going to hear from the department or the city of Dothan next?
City of Dothan, Your Honor. Your Honor, sorry. You are honorable, Dr. Miller. May I remove this, please? Thank you. My name is Buddy Cox, and I represent the city of Dothan. And Dothan objects to the hearing officer's recommendations that the commission disapprove the department's decision permitting the city to expand its municipal landfill. The city has worked to obtain a permit to expand its existing landfill for a long time, as you know from reading the record. Two issues prompted the hearing officer to recommend the commission disapprove the modification to the permit, and the city would submit to you that in this instance, the hearing officer got both those recommendations wrong. The first does have to do with host government approval. The city obtained host government approval to expand the existing landfill on September 16, 2014. No additional host government approval was necessary. The city wears two hats here. It wears the hat as the applicant as well as the host government. It continued to approve the permit through budgeting, through approval of engineering contracts and the like in its role as the applicant, but the host government approval to expand the landfill was issued in 2014, and that's all that was necessary. And that's because the Alabama legislature created a clear line between what host governments determine and what ADEM determines. They basically laid out 6 factors that the host government has to consider before issuing approval of a new or expansion of an existing landfill. It is absolutely clear that in 2014, the city made a determination as to each of those 6 factors, had a public hearing as they were required to do. No, the landfill design was not complete at that time, but the city authorized the expansion of the footprint of the landfill, and they authorized where it was to be located. That's what they were assigned to do by the legislature, is to consider those 6 factors. They considered it all. The petitioner offered no evidence that they failed to do any of those, look at any of those factors. And the other thing is, what would happen to ADEM if you accept this recommendation of the hearing officer? They're no longer going to be able to accept an applicant's evidence as to whether the host government approval has been given or not. They're going to have to go behind that. And that's not the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law was basically to protect ADEM from expending their resources, time, and effort in looking at landfills if the host government didn't support the landfill in the first instance. It's an if-then-else situation. If the host government approves it, then ADEM can expend their resources to evaluate the actual application. And that's what's happened here. So we just think that the hearing officer got it wrong. The pursuant to this section language in 222748 is important. It refers to the 6 criteria host governments are required to look at. It doesn't apply to the specific application. The other issue is during ADEM's process, they can ask for more information. If they do, does it have to go back to the host government and get another approval? Because additional information requested by ADEM becomes part of the application. So I think the hearing officer absolutely got that wrong. And as for groundwater, the hearing officer also recommended that the permit not be approved because the city failed to collect the 222 sampling required for February, March, and April. The undisputed expert testimony is that the sample the city collected on January 28th was not significant for making a determination as to whether the groundwater level would be less than 5 feet below the bottom of the liner. And that's the purpose of this statute. And the city did more than that. Because the city has an existing landfill that they continue to monitor, they kept looking at the groundwater after they did the initial sampling in January, February, March, and April. And anytime they took a sample that actually showed a groundwater level higher, they considered that as part of their application. They didn't just stop with January, February, or March. The way the hearing officer interprets this, it would basically preclude somebody from using a piece of data that showed that the groundwater potential could rise higher than what is reported in January, February, or March, or February, March, and April, excuse me. And it's important to recognize that this is a confined aquifer. This is the Lisbon aquifer. This is the groundwater potential. This is when you stick a hole through the confining layer and the groundwater rises up in an artesian situation. All the evidence indicated that that only would happen if the confining layer was somehow evaded or was compromised. That's not going to happen here. So we know that all of the testimony was ADEM was convinced that there was going to be much more than a 5-foot separation between the actual groundwater, the Lisbon aquifer, and the bottom of the liner. So given that testimony, given that the hearing officer basically, I think, failed to understand how the city used all the data they were collected to make a informed decision that was presented to ADEM, in which Slagle and the other department witnesses testified to, that they had more than sufficient information to evaluate the permit application and determine that it substantially met all the criteria of the permit, including maintaining that 5-foot separation between the bottom of the liner and the top of the groundwater. And because of those errors, we asked that the commission not adopt the hearing officer's report and recommendation, but that they approve the petitioner's alternative order, which would approve the permit issued by the department. The last thing I want to say in my remaining time is that this was an appeal of both the existing permit, the renewal of the existing permit, and the expansion or modification of the permit. The hearing officer wasn't clear in his proposed order about the renewal of the existing permit. But if you read the order, there's no finding of fact. Host government approval and the groundwater application for the expansion of the landfill, it should have no effect at all on the renewal of the existing permit. So if the commission is not convinced that the permit should be approved, we would ask that you clarify the hearing officer's report and make sure that the renewal of the existing permit is allowed. So thank you very much.
If it's okay, if I remove my mask, that's okay. Okay, thank you, Chairman Miller, members of the commission. My name's Todd Carter with the Office of General Counsel. I can put my glasses back on, they won't fog up anymore. And what we're here today is to basically discuss with you the objections that we filed to the hearing officer's report. And most importantly, answer any questions the commission may have on this matter. The permit had the necessary local approval. And I think the city, their argument a while ago, we concur with that argument. On September 16, 2004, they passed a resolution. That resolution allowed for the expansion of the landfill within the boundaries and also specifically included a citation to Alabama case code 222748 that they had considered those 6 criteria in their decision. At that point, that was local host government approval. The hearing officer failed to properly recognize that role. When he is basically in his recommendation said that that focused on such application and basically implied that the ADEM application must be submitted for consideration above the local host government. That application is 600 plus pages long. It doesn't include any of the information that they would have to consider under Section 48C of the code. So the city neither had the time, the expertise, or to look at and evaluate that information in their decision. Their decision was based on the 6 criteria found in the code, and all those criteria go toward the local planning process and land use concerns. Now, and I think Mr. Lutter referred to it too, by them the hearing officer focusing in on that narrow section of that sentence and in the statute, such application. In our briefs, we do cite a case. It's a Department of Revenue versus City of Huntsville. And what that case does is say you have to look at the entire statute.
You can't just pick pieces out of it to determine the meaning. And that's, the word application is used throughout that statute. Then also, I think Mr. Cox referred to it in his arguments. What the hearing officer has done now is created basically an unworkable process. You know, if the application had to go before the city, they have to put it through a public comment period, public hearing, and then once they approve it, it's included in the ADEM application. It's a part of the ADEM application. And then it would come to ADEM. ADEM looks at it, evaluates it, goes through a public notice comment period. Based on that public notice and comment period, if there are changes made in that application, it goes back for local approval. And every time that happens, there's the possibility of changes being made. So it basically can be put into an endless loop, an unworkable process. And basically, in one of the case we cited in our briefs, Ex parte Hayes, the courts have basically said if the legislature, or in a situation where the courts are asked to interpret a statute, and they've got one interpretation that is workable and fair, and one interpretation that is unworkable and unjust, they assume that the legislature intends that the statute is to be workable and fair. And that's the way they rule. And in this situation, I think what the hearing officer left us with is an unworkable situation and something that would be very fair to the regulated community and potential permittees. His recommendation overturns long-standing interpretations and threatens uncertainty in the permitting process. So based on that, we would ask that the commission reject that recommendation on the hearing officer and adopt the alternate findings of fact, conclusion of law as submitted by the city and adopted by the department. Now, on the groundwater issue, we know what the requirements are under the statute. Now, there's some talk. Our argument in our case was substantial compliance, that based on the data presented by the city and evaluated by our personnel here at ADEM, the permit was in the application was in substantial compliance with the regulations. So at that point, and I think what the experts testified to during the hearing, is that 3-day window, 3 days of January prior to February, was non-significant. Well, what exactly do they mean by saying non-significant? Because I know that may be a question you have. First, it goes back to site characterization. As Mr. Cox referred to, groundwater is the Lisbon Aquifer. We know where the groundwater is. Now, if you punch a hole into it, artesian rise causes it to come up. Well, and what I think the testimony was during the hearing is a conservative measure. They took the measurements of all those wells, which included the artesian rise. In fact, it took the highest measurements for not just 3 months, but for a long time, and to figure out where the elevation for the bottom of that liner needed to be. So in light of that, that 3-day difference is non-significant in the eyes of the expert geologists that testified. Now, one of the other issues is that the geologists talked about was recharge. The aquifer under the Lisbon Aquifer doesn't recharge based on the rain that falls on that landfill. That aquifer is recharged many miles, 10, 100 miles away. And so there's not a situation where that February, March, and April readings are significant as it applies to recharging that aquifer. Okay, the experts all agreed. It was undisputed. We also cited in our case the plumber steam fitter case. I think it's very interesting. It's very similar issues. It was a situation where the department, in a permitting decision, decided to go against, to not require the testing for benzene and arsenic at the plastic facility out at Burkeville. Well, in that situation, they say basically the law does not concern itself with trifle matters. And also that principle right there applies in the administrative setting as well. And what they held is that the department nor the commission erred by taking that part and not including that as a requirement under that permit. Okay. The hearing officer's conclusion is toward the groundwater, elevates form over substance. So the permit is protected of groundwater, and we would ask you to reject that finding as well by the hearing officer, and accept the permit, approve it. And I'll be happy to I see my time's up. I'll happy to entertain any questions that the commission members may have.
We certainly would like to open the floor to any of the three attorneys being questioned. Does anybody have any questions? Our geologist raised his hand.
Mr. Cox, do you have a copy of your proposed alternate findings of fact?
I do.
In front of you? It's just something reading all this information. Turn to page 7 of that document. The third paragraph down, let me know when you're there.
I'm getting there, I'm sorry.
Long time. Most of these are.
Page 7?
Page 7, third paragraph. I think this is just a typo, and I just wanted to ask you. In the third paragraph, the last two words, pin fitted, I think probably that should be permitted.
Oh,
Is that correct?
yes, it should be permitted.
Okay, I thought that was your intent. And then on page 11, the large paragraph in the middle of the page, starting with the word department, the next to the last line, right at the end of that line, it says.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Should be less than. Or it's a,
Well, in the hearing officer report, it was permeability of 10 to the minus fifth centimeters per second. Of course, you had LE.
should be 10 to the minus fifth.
Okay.
I apologize.
No, it's okay. I just want to clarify the record there.
Tim, I have a question. Just, I don't know who's the most appropriate to answer, but I'm picking up on Cox's comment about existing permit and modified permit. So does the city have an existing landfill permit?
Yes, sir, they do. They've had an existing permit since 1987 for this facility.
So it's still in.
It's been renewed every year, it's been renewed several times. Director LaFleur says 5 times.
5 years.
5 years, and it's a 5-year, it's a 5-year permit, so it gets renewed every 5th year.
So really, that's kind of not an issue.
Well,
The issue is
the-
modification.
well, the issue is that the renewal and the modification were issued in the same permit. It's permit number 3506, and if the action of the commission is to disapprove that permit, then that would also affect the renewal, even though there's no finding of fact that would indicate that that would be appropriate.
I understand.
Do we have any other questions? Well, we have several options to consider here. Number one, we could move to adopt the report of the hearing officer. Secondly, we could move to approve the petitioner's proposed order. Third, we could move to approve the department's proposed order. Fourth, we could move to approve the intervener's proposed order and the corrected intervener's alternative findings of fact and conclusion. Or we could move to approve the intervener's proposed conditional order and the corrected intervener's alternative findings of fact and conclusion. the last option, a conditional order would be an appropriate thing for us to consider. I'm not sure we have the ability or the expertise to do that. So I will move, open the floor for proposals and motions to approve one of the five options. Do I have a motion?
Move to approve the department's proposed order.
We have a move to approve the department's proposed order. Do we have a second to that motion?
Second to the motion.
And we have a second. Any further discussion?
Could we clarify what the department's proposed order is? I guess it honestly bothers me a little bit. I like to have all the I's dotted and T's crossed. It bothers me that we're encouraging something that deviates from the stated regulations. And although from a pragmatic standpoint, I'm thoroughly convinced that what has been proposed and is reasonable and sound judgment and technically speaking, even the part about the city's endorsement of the game plan, that I'm thoroughly convinced that's the intent and this is the manner of things committed. So, but it just bothers me that we're going to be, if I've understood the department's proposed order, please pardon me, because I got about 9,000 documents here. Got to keep track of what's what. So it I do encourage the city in the future, please follow the regulations to the letter. And also, if you're going to submit something, please review it so that we don't have any future typos. Thank you.
Todd Carter, would you like to comment on Commissioner Walter's thoughts?
Just, Chairman Miller and members of the commission, I know one of the other things, just as a side before it slips my mind, we would also, there was a need to adopt alternate findings of facts and conclusions of law if the commission so sees to adopt the proposed order issued by the department. In our proposed order, basically what we're asking the commission to do is to do that, to adopt the alternate findings of fact, conclusions of law submitted by the city and as well concurred upon by the department. Now, what this would entail would be the commission rejecting the recommendations of the hearing officer as to those two issues and basically voting to approve the permit and renewal of the permit for the city of Dothan. And now, so I kind of forgot what the question may have been, particularly about the.
Well, it wasn't so much a question, it was just a comment that the application didn't follow the regulations of the letter of the law.
Absolutely, sir, and that's what. Yes, sir. And we've recognized that in this situation, and that's one of those things I think we're going to, but that we, like in this particular situation, I think the evidence was so overwhelming as toward the characterization of the groundwater that when that was realized, that we felt safe with and that the groundwater was protected under the requirements of the permit.
I agree with that. If that's something that's within our authority and power to kind of offer that judgment, then I'm good.
Yes, sir, and it is within the law. That's why I offered that case of the plumbers and steam fitters versus ADEM in that situation. I think it's the finding that it says we do have that discretion.
Robert, are you satisfied with the motion as it is stated, or do we need to amend the motion?
I think it would be in your best interest to clarify the motion. Maybe Commissioner Massengill could do that.
Could you suggest some wording, perhaps? Would that be a bad thing to do?
Well,
I'll let Commissioner Massengill take a stab at it.
okay. I would think we ought to order a judge and decree that the findings of fact and conclusions of law and recommendations of the hearing officer to the commission are hereby rejected. And this is from the hearing officer. And that we approve alternate findings of fact, conclusions of law, and recommendation that was presented by the city of Dothan and that were supported by the department. Also, the department issuance of the renewal and modification of the permit complied with the applicable statutes and regulations, and that the commission therefore approved the renewal and modification of the permit.
Well, Commission members, I think, again, what you have before you are essentially four options. You can either approve or reject the hearing officer's findings of facts, conclusions of law, and recommendation. You can adopt the petitioner's proposed order in this case, Mr. Lutters. You can, which would be to modify, I believe, the hearing officer's report. Or you can adopt the City of Dothan's proposed findings of fact, conclusions of law, and that would also be to modify the hearing officer's report. Or the department's proposed order, which would be to modify the hearing officer's report by adopting the City of Dothan's findings of facts and conclusions of law. And I think those are your options. Ultimately, you know, your options are to adopt, reject, or modify. And I don't think what you're proposing here is to reject. I think what you're proposing here to do is to modify. And my sense is that what you're proposing here to do is to modify by accepting the department's order, which incorporates the City of Dothan's findings of facts, conclusions of law, and recommendation. And I apologize that it's that complicated, but that's the way it seems to me. And I'm not going to, you know, suggest that as a motion, but I think that's where you're going with this. Okay. I don't know. Is that?
No, that's
I can't make the motion for you.
Yes, that's what I was
Would you
trying.
attempt to restate your motion?
I'll do that. Yes, I move that we modify and that in essence what Mr. Tamlin stated, that we modify the petition and that we accept the findings of fact, conclusions of law, and recommendations, the alternate findings of fact, conclusion, law, recommendation that was stated by the City of Dothan.
Give me a second to write it down, and I'll present it to all of the sides so they can see it. And if that's what you're trying to say, and you go forward.
Good idea. I must admit that going through this tremendous stack of documents, that I started off with water, and then I went to black coffee, and then I started thinking about whiskey. My eyes this certainly is an extremely complicated case. And, one that we may hear about again. You gonna give that to Todd and Mr. Butter, make sure they're.
Okay, I thought I'd just explain it to them
Okay.
from here. It seems to me that what Commissioner Massengale is offering to do is to modify the hearing officer's report by moving to adopt the department's proposed order adopting the city's findings of facts and conclusions of law and recommendation. Is that y'all's understanding?
Could you repeat that at the microphone, please?
Yes. My understanding is that Commissioner Massengale is offering the following motion: to modify the hearing officer's report, in this case, by adopting the department's proposed order, which in turn adopts the city's findings of facts and conclusions of law and recommendation. And it is convoluted. But that is my understanding of what is before you at this point.
You want to hand that piece of paper to the commissioner?
If he can read it.
Or is he already got it in there?
I hope I do. Thank you, Robert.
Before you do that, I'm sorry.
Sure.
So is I'm once again, the more I look at these, the more confused document. So the alternate findings of fact, conclusions of all the recommendations presented by the city and adopted by the department, is that, I'm trying to find that document, I think that document number, file number 113.
You talking about the city?
Yeah.
That was 114.
114?
I think so, Tom.
Oh, there we go.
Good.
Thank you. I didn't like the language of 113. Because it got into that conditional part. That was a lot of concern.
Right. No, I agree.
I got you. I'm with you now. I'm on the.
Okay.
I'm on the
Okay.
Yeah.
I move we modify the hearing officer report by adopting the department's proposed order, which in turn, we would, in essence, we would be approving the alternate findings of fact and conclusion of law and recommendations that the city of Dothan was proposing.
Do we have a second to the new motion?
Third time's a charm.
I remain with the second that I stated before.
We have a motion and a second. Do we have any further discussion or questions for the attorney? If not, I'll call for the question. All in favor of Commissioner Massengale's motion, please signify by raising your right hand. All opposed? Same sign.
Chair Bidwell, I will have to obviously revise the front page, but I do have a signature page that
Okay.
will work.
next item is agenda item number 6, Jeffrey Allen Wade versus ADEM, docket number 20-03. We have a report from the hearing officer which recommends that the request for a hearing be dismissed. And I will entertain a motion from the commission to either adopt or disapprove the report of the hearing officer.
I move we adopt the report of the hearing officer.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Here, a motion and a second. And we'll ask for any further discussion. I'm calling for the question. The motion is to approve the report of the hearing officer. All in favor, raise your right hand. All opposed, same sign. Do we have any other business that we need to consider? What about, do we have any conflicts for the date of August the 14th, 2020 for the next commission meeting? Anybody with no conflict?
Well, I did.
You did?
I did. I don't think I'm gonna get to do it, though.
Uh-oh.
I got, won the lottery to play the old course at St. Andrews.
Wow.
But I don't think I'm gonna get to go.
If that comes about, that's certainly gonna be an excuse.
That would be an excuse. We're hoping that we can, get dispensation to just do it next year. But anyhow, so there was potential that
Now, Debbie, as far as I know, we had no requests for the 3-minute public,
No requests.
all right. I'll now entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed. Our meeting's adjourned.